So this lesson is for higher pupils studying geography and it's on population structures. Now, in the higher exam, you will be you may be asked to talk about either an LEDC or an MEDC in the form of a population pyramid. There could be a question in which you're asked to compare the two. The main thing is that you can recognise the basic shapes. If it has a wide bottom and a narrow top, it's an LEDC, and the reverse is true for richer countries. In this question, what you might be asked to do is to talk about what the future problems are for these countries. So the first thing to be able to do is to identify the issues that the countries are facing. The first issue that can be identified is the wide base of the pyramid. Now, this wide base here indicates that there is a high birth rate, which I'll denote with HBR. The fact that the graph very, very steeply narrows indicates that of all those people who were born, as they age, they die very rapidly. So there must be a high death rate. So the curved side indicates a high death rate. You'll probably find that there is a lower life expectancy in LEDCs as well. You may also find that males who are on the left-hand side of the graph outweigh, as in there are slightly more of them, females. And that will be most likely, in a stereotypical circumstance, true in the early years of birth, as it will be the case throughout the rest of the graph. Okay, in an MEDC, you'll find a low birth rate and a low death rate, indicated by the fact that the graph actually appears to get wider towards the top, indicating that people die very slowly, and clearly there are a lot of old people. So we get into a second level of observations here. There's a large old age population. This means that there is a small young dependent population and a large active population. In the LEDC case study, there is a large young dependent population, a small elderly dependent population, and consequentially, because people are dying quite rapidly, quite a small working age population too. So, from all of these basic observations that we can make, we can then start talking about the future problems that these countries will have. And that's really what you're going to have to revise to do. So, if I just move the board up a little bit here, we can start to note down some of these ideas. Essentially, concentrating on the LEDC case study, they've got lots and lots of young children and babies. So, the problems associated with this would be lack of hospitals and healthcare. The problem that you'll have in the exam is, or the teachers have in the exam, is that pupils are unwilling to expand beyond that. Lack of hospitals isn't enough. You need to package that up into a more detailed paragraph. So lack of hospitals, training for midwives, we also need to think about provision of inoculation. That means vaccines for diseases. These all cost money. needed for, and then you just think of something that the money might be needed for housing, perhaps. This is how to make a point talking about the future problems. There's going to be a lack of hospitals, there's going to need to be more training for midwives, you're going to have more provision of inoculations, all of that costs money, and that money's needed elsewhere. That's a much more rounded point. Other things we might talk about here are the fact that these young children here are also going to need to be educated. Schools needed. Don't stop there, expand beyond that point. Teachers need to be trained. You might see parallels between my first paragraph and the second. Hospitals need built, midwives need trained, schools need built, teachers need trained. And we will also need to provide other resources like colleges. This is very expensive again. But if you're worried that you're repeating yourself between this point and that point, it's very expensive and the demand is too high. It's going to be very difficult for this country to build enough schools for this massively growing population of youngsters. Okay, moving on. We can talk about what happens as this young population gets older. Well, they're going to need jobs. So there's going to be a job shortage. There will need to be training for the jobs. That's going to be difficult to provide. So there will be future unemployment. You could even suggest that that future unemployment might lead to, for example, future civil disturbance as people get angry that they don't have jobs to go to. So civil disobedience. Referring back to the graph again, because these children are all going to grow up into a working population that hasn't got enough jobs, there's going to be a lot more poverty. This could lead to a growth in poverty. What else would that, well, these young children in this high birth rate, what else will they need as they progress into adulthood? They're going to need housing. So there is a future need for housing. This is very costly. And because it's very costly, it's unlikely to happen. So that means that there are going to be a growth in slums and shantytowns. This equals a growth in slums. And you could link to that then you're going to have more disease, you're going to have more overcrowding, and more social problems of that nature. Okay, if we consider now we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 well-balanced points there, that's how to explain the problems associated with a younging population, with a population that's getting younger. You're going to have to provide education, housing, training, healthcare, food for this rapidly expanding population. A last point to finish on would be that because of all these growing number of youngsters, this working population here, which is already quite small, is going to have to provide quite a lot of taxation to pay for any of this education and healthcare that we seek to provide. If we move over onto the other side now, in fact, what I'll do is I'll put those notes back up for 1 second. You can pause the video now if you wish to look at them more closely. And now I'll switch to talking about the MEDCs. Now in an MEDC, they've got the opposite. They've not got a large young dependent population, they've got a very small young dependent population. This leads to a completely different set of problems. Their problems are more linked to the large number of old people that they have. The old dependent population is very high. So there is a need for care homes and trained carers or geriatric nurses. This is very costly and requires either a lot of taxpayers' money, but I like to save that reason for later. What care homes do require is that the entire population in the working bracket are saving a lot of money to pay for their own elderly care. So it requires people to save a lot for the future. Okay, next. We've got a need for care homes and trained carers. We will have to pay more tax. One of the reasons that your generation into the future is going to be paying a lot of tax is you're going to pay more tax for more hospital beds, for things that elderly people get for free or get money off. For example, free bus passes, TV licenses, and flu jabs. Notice again, just like before, I'm not just saying something simplistic like the working population will need to pay more tax for hospitals. That's not how the higher exam works. You're going to be expected to give more detail, and it's really important that you package out each point into greater detail, giving several examples, really driving your points home. So, more tax for hospitals, etc. We're going to have longer waiting lists at the GPs, and hospital bed shortages. Elderly people present other problems too. Because the cost of living is going up and being elderly people are being elderly for a much longer period of time. This means that people often don't have enough money to, well, quite frankly, survive through their retirement. So older people are working for longer. This means that as this elderly generation here work for longer, that means that those jobs those elderly people are doing are not necessarily available to the younger people in the workforce. So, the retirement age goes up. I know from marking your work that the weakness you have with this answer is you just stop there. Some of you just say that, the retirement age goes up. Why is that a bad thing is what you need to point out. And the retirement age going up is a bad thing because it denies jobs to the younger people, which I'll just write as young workforce, YWF. There are more issues associated with the elderly. For example, there's going to be an increase in long-term degenerative mental health care, mental illness, I'm sorry. What I mean here is Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's. There are some statistics that suggest that this is the third biggest killer of elderly people in Britain. Onset for Parkinson's gets tested from 50 years and over in this country now. And this is on the rise, and it's a very, very, very costly illness to deal with because you need full-time care. So this is a really serious point, and it stands on its own. There's an increase in long-term degenerative mental illness, and it requires full-time care. There are some interesting case studies we've studied in class. For example, in Japan, they have robot toys that have been introduced into care homes to act as people, really, for elderly residents in those homes to interact with. And the little robot toy reminds them when to take medication, for example, and gives them some stimulus to encourage emotional responses. Kind of looks funny, but it's really a bit sad. The bell. Okay, so once again, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 really key points. Just looking back at the graph, the main points here are you've got very few young people, and therefore our working population, this is the final point to consider, the working population is only going to get smaller. There's going to be fewer and fewer working people in the future, and that means that that group of people are going to get taxed more and more and more heavily to provide for all the long-term care, the long-term housing, the free bus passes and free TV licenses for the growing number of elderly people. Okay, that's it.